The knock came like a crack in the silence. For 20 years, the only sounds in the adobe house were the wind and the whisper of two people growing old. No visitors, no neighbors, no knocks. The desert kept people away. It kept secrets buried. So when 3 small raps echoed through the room just after sundown, Ellis rose from his chair like a man waking from a long, bad dream. His joints screamed, but his eyes were sharp. He looked at his wife, Clara. She hadn't moved. Her hands were wrapped around a chipped mug, but he saw the tremor. He saw everything. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice a dry rasp. She just nodded, her gaze locked on the heavy wooden door, as if she could see right through it, as if she knew what was waiting on the other side. "Go slow," she whispered. He always did. The world had taught Ellis that speed gets you killed. Patience gets you one more sunrise. He moved across the floor, his old boots making no sound. His hand, calloused and scarred, found the stock of the hunting rifle leaning against the wall. He didn't lift it. Not yet. He just let his fingers remember the weight of it. He drew the bolt, the sound deafening in the quiet. He pulled the door open just a crack, and the rifle fell from his hand. It clattered on the stone floor, loud as a gunshot. Because what stood on his doorstep wasn't a threat. It wasn't a lost traveler or a bandit. It was 3 children. They were just silhouettes against the last gasp of purple daylight. The oldest, a boy no more than 12, stood with his shoulders squared, a little soldier guarding his tiny army. Behind him, a girl clutched the hand of a toddler, a little thing that didn't cry or whimper. She just stared with eyes that were too old, too tired, too empty. Clara was suddenly beside him, a ghost in the doorway. She let out a breath she'd been holding for 20 years. The boy's voice was brittle, like dry leaves. "We walked," he said. "No more food." Ellis didn't say a word. He just opened the door wider. Clara moved past him, her skirt brushing the dusty floor. She dropped to her knees in front of the smallest child, her hand hovering, afraid to touch. Then her fingers grazed the toddler's cheek. "She's burning up," Clara breathed. The older girl pulled the little one closer, a flash of fear in her eyes, as if Clara was a monster who might steal her away. Ellis nudged the fallen rifle aside with his boot. He had no use for it now. "Come in," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Now!" The boy didn't move. He looked at Clara, then at Ellis. It wasn't fear in his eyes. It was pride, a terrible, broken pride that had carried him this far. He held Ellis's gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod and guided his sisters over the threshold. They brought nothing with them, no bags, no coats. The youngest didn't even have shoes. They just brought the dust of the road and the smell of fear, and something else. Something Ellis couldn't quite name. It felt like the beginning of an end. Clara moved with a speed Ellis hadn't seen in her for 2 decades. She was a different woman now. Not the quiet, grieving wife who stared at the horizon, but a general commanding a field hospital. She pulled blankets from the cedar chest, the smell of mothballs and memory filling the small room. She laid them by the fire, her movements sharp and certain. Ellis fetched water from the kettle on the stove. He poured it into a tin cup and offered it to the boy first. The boy was the leader. The boy was the one who had to believe they were safe. "My name's Ellis," he said. "This is Clara." The boy hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting around the room, cataloging every exit, every shadow. Then he drank, long and deep, like he was trying to wash away the miles. "I'm Jesse," he gasped between gulps. "She's Ruth. The baby's May." Clara's hands shook as she gently unwrapped May's tiny, limp arms from around Ruth's neck. The baby's skin was hot and dry. Her lips were cracked. She didn't even have the strength to cry. "How long have you been out there?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. 2 days walking, Jesse answered, his eyes on the fire. "Before that, we were at the Ridgetown mission. They ran out of food." Ellis swore under his breath. The Ridgetown mission. A place run by the territorial government, a place whispered about in town. Not a place of God, but a place of last resort, a dumping ground for the forgotten. He knew the stories. He turned to the stove and started feeding kindling into the firebox, the flames leaping up, hungry. But the kind of cold those children had in their bones couldn't be chased away by fire alone. Dinner was a thin barley soup. It was all they had. But the way Jesse ate it, head down, spoon moving like a piston, made Ellis wish he'd slaughtered their last chicken. Ruth barely touched her bowl. She just stared into it. Clara knelt beside her, spooning the broth to her lips, coaxing her, her voice a low hum. It was a sound Elas hadn't heard since they were young, since they still had hope, since they buried their only child, a stillborn girl, under a flat, nameless stone behind the house. Clara hadn't just buried their daughter that day. She'd buried the part of herself that knew how to be a mother, until now. When May whimpered in her sleep, a small, weak sound, Clara didn't hesitate. She lifted the baby, tucked her into the folds of her shawl, and began to rock, back and forth, a rhythm as old as time itself. Night fell heavy and silent over the desert. The children were curled up in a heap of quilts by the hearth, their small bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion. Elas and Clara sat at the kitchen table, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. 3 of them, Ayla said, finally breaking the silence. No parents. Jesse hadn't said another word about where they came from. He didn't have to. Elas had seen it all in the boy's eyes, the constant vigilance, the way his hand always stayed near his sister's, ready to shield them. They have us, Clara murmured, her gaze fixed on the sleeping children. For now. The silence returned, but it was different this time. It wasn't the empty, crushing silence of grief. It was the quiet of a held breath, the quiet of something about to happen. What Elas didn't know was that the knock on the door wasn't an accident. It wasn't a random chance of fate. The children hadn't just found them. They had been sent, and the man who sent them was coming to collect. Dawn broke, painting the dust-filled air in shades of rose and gold. Clara was already up, slicing the last of their winter apples. Elas stepped outside into the sharp morning chill to split kindling and found Jesse already there, hauling wood from the stack, his jaw set, his small frame straining with the effort. "You don't have to do that," Elas started. "I do," Jesse said, not looking at him. His voice was flat, final. Elas just nodded. He knew that kind of pride, the kind that kept you moving when all you wanted to do was fall down. They worked side by side, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound between them. Inside, Clara was helping Ruth wash her face. The girl flinched when the cool water touched her skin, but she didn't pull away. Clara gently worked the tangles from her hair with an old comb, her touch so soft it was almost a prayer. Ruth looked up, her big, dark eyes full of a question she was almost too afraid to ask. Is it okay if we stay? Just a little longer?" Her voice was so small it almost got lost in the crackle of the fire. Clara's throat closed up. She leaned down and kissed the girl's forehead, a gesture so natural it surprised her. "Of course," she whispered, "as long as you need." When Elas and Jesse came back inside, the smell of frying apples and cinnamon filled the house. Ruth actually smiled. A small, tentative thing, but it was like seeing the first flower after a long winter. Later that afternoon, Clara sat on the porch, rocking May, who was finally sleeping a deep, peaceful sleep. Ruth sat beside her, her head resting against Clara's arm. Elas leaned against the doorframe, watching Jesse try to teach the chickens to do tricks. The boy was serious, focused, as if the fate of the world depended on a hen pecking a specific spot in the dirt. For a moment, it felt real. It felt like a family. It felt like a lie. Because that night, Ruth's prayers were different. She knelt by her little bed of quilts, her hands clasped tight, and whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for the bread," she murmured. "Thank you that May's not coughing anymore. Please don't let Jesse go away. And please, please don't let the shadow man find us." Clara, who was about to tuck her in, froze. "What shadow man, sweet girl?" Ruth's eyes flew open, wide with terror. She clamped her mouth shut, shaking her head. Jesse was suddenly there, standing in the doorway to the main room. His face was pale. "She's just tired," he said quickly. "She has nightmares." But Clara saw the look that passed between them. It wasn't a nightmare. It was a memory. The peace lasted for 7 days. 7 days of fragile, borrowed joy. Clara unpacked a sewing kit that hadn't seen the light of day in 20 years and started mending their clothes. Elas found himself whittling a small wooden bird, something his own father had taught him to do. He planned to give it to May. On the 7th morning, as Elas stood by the fence nursing a mug of coffee, he saw it. A rider on the horizon. A lone figure kicking up a plume of dust, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. Jesse came to stand beside him, his body instantly rigid, a small rock in his hand. "You know him?" Jesse asked, his voice low. "Not yet," Elas said. But a cold dread was already coiling in his gut. The man rode right up to their gate and stopped. He didn't dismount. He just sat on his tired-looking horse, his hat pulled low, surveying the house, the chickens, the 2 figures by the fence. He took in every detail. Then he spoke, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Heard you took in some strays." Clara came to the door, with Ruth hiding behind her skirts. "Depends who's asking," Elas called back, his hand itching for the rifle he'd left inside. The rider pushed back his hat, revealing a gaunt face and eyes as sharp as broken glass. "Name's Connell. I work with the circuit preacher. Been tracking where the Ridgetown kids scattered after the mission ran dry. Heard 3 went missing." Jesse went so still he might have been carved from stone. "You're not taking them," Elas said. It wasn't a question. "Ain't here to take 'em," Connell replied, his gaze flicking to Jesse. "I'm here to deliver a message." Elas's blood ran cold. "What message?" Connell's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He knows they're here. He wants his property back." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Property. Jesse took a step forward, his face a mask of fury. "We're not his property." Connell just shrugged, his eyes empty. "That ain't what the ledger says, boy. He paid for you, all 3 of you, fair and square." And that's when Elas understood. The Ridgetown mission wasn't a charity, it was a marketplace, and these children had been sold. The world tilted on its axis. The quiet ranch, the warm kitchen, the scent of baking bread, it all dissolved into a mirage. Elas felt the ground give way beneath his feet. He looked at the 3 children, truly looked at them, and saw not orphans, but fugitives, not hungry mouths, but stolen goods. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled gasp escaping. "Who?" Elas forced the word out. "Who is he?" Connell leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A man named Vaser ran the books at Ridgetown. When the territory pulled its funding, he didn't see it as a failure. He saw it as a business opportunity. Took the ledgers, took the children nobody would miss, and set up his own enterprise." Jesse was shaking, his small fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. "He's not a man. He's a monster." "He's a businessman," Connell corrected, his tone detached. "And he's not happy. You're cutting into his profits." He paused, letting the horror of his words sink in. "He sent me to make you an offer. Return the children, and he'll overlook the inconvenience. No questions asked." "Get off my land," Elas said, his voice a low growl. Connell's eyes hardened. "That's your answer? You're an old man, and she's a woman. Vaser has men who don't ask questions. You think you can protect them?" Clara stepped forward then, her spine straight as a steel rod. Ruth was still clinging to her skirt, but Clara's voice didn't shake. "They are not property. They are children. They sleep under our roof now. You tell your Mr. Vaser that if he wants them, he'll have to come through me." A flicker of something. Was it surprise, respect? Crossed Connell's face. He studied them for a long moment, then gave a tight nod. "Your funeral," he said, pulling his hat back down. "But don't say I didn't warn you. He'll send more than just a messenger next time." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a silence thick with terror. As the rider vanished into the heat shimmer, Jesse finally turned to Elas, his face pale, his eyes burning. "Do we have to go?" "No," Ellis said, placing a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is your home now. We don't run." But the seed of fear had been planted. All day, Clara watched the horizon the way she once watched for rain clouds during a drought. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow looked like a man. That night, Ruth had a nightmare. A real one this time. She woke up screaming, clawing at her blankets, her voice choked with sobs as she cried out a name. "Leah! He took Leah!" Clara was there in an instant, holding her, rocking her. "Shh, shh, it's all right, you're safe." Jesse stood in the doorway, his face a ghostly white in the moonlight. "Leah was our baby sister," he said, his voice hollow. "At the mission, Vaser, he sold her first. To a man heading west, we never saw her again." The story came out in broken pieces. Ridgetown wasn't just a place of neglect. It was a place of organized cruelty. Vaser was the architect. He'd buy children from desperate families or take them as wards of the territory. Then he'd sell them, boys for labor, girls for other things. The ledger was his inventory. Their names, their ages, their price. "I tried to stop him," Jesse whispered, his voice cracking. "The night he took Leah, I bit his hand. He locked me in the cellar for a week. No food, no light." Ellis looked at the boy, this child who had seen more evil than most soldiers, and felt a rage so pure and hot it nearly choked him. "You carry too much, son." Jesse's jaw tightened. "There's no one else to carry it." "That's not true anymore," Ellis said, his voice fierce. But even as he said it, he knew words weren't enough. Vaser wasn't a ghost story. He was a real threat, and he was coming. The next morning, Ellis made a decision. He rode into town, a place he hadn't visited in over a year. He went to the marshal's office. The man behind the desk, Marshal Greaves, was stout, with a face full of broken veins and a star on his chest that looked as tired as he did. Elas told him the story, about the children, about Connell, about Vaser. Greaves listened patiently, steepling his fingers. When Ellis was done, the marshal sighed, a long, weary sound. "Look, Elas," he said, his tone patronizing. "I hear stories like this all the time. Ridgetown was a mess, but Vaser, he's a ghost. No one's ever been able to pin anything on him, and Connell is a known bounty hunter. He works for whoever pays." He leaned back in his chair. "You have no proof, just the word of a scared kid. I have 3 children hiding in my house." Elas slammed his hand on the desk. Greaves didn't flinch. "And my advice is to keep them hiding. You start making noise, you start pointing fingers at men like Vaser, and you're just painting a target on your own back, and on theirs." He stood up, a clear dismissal. "Go home, Elas. Enjoy your new family. Pray he forgets about you." Elas rode home with a stone in his stomach. The law wasn't going to help them. They were alone. When he got back to the ranch, Clara met him at the door, her face anxious. He didn't have to say anything. She saw the defeat in his eyes, but then she pointed toward the barn. "Someone's here." Elas's heart stopped. He grabbed the rifle from its place by the door. He crept toward the barn, every nerve on fire. He peered through a crack in the old wood. And he saw Jesse. The boy was talking to someone. A girl, a teenager, maybe 16 or 17, dressed in rags, her face smudged with dirt and tears. She was clutching something to her chest, a small leather-bound book. It was a ledger. "He's coming," the girl sobbed. "He knows I took it. He'll kill me." "Who are you?" Jesse asked. The girl looked up, her eyes wide with terror. "My name is Annabelle," she whispered. "Vaser, he's my father." The air in the barn was thick with the smell of hay and terror. Elas felt his world shrink down to the space between the wooden slats. Vaser's daughter. Here. With the ledger. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a detonation. Jesse's face was a mask of disbelief. Your father? Annabelle nodded, her body trembling uncontrollably. He's not what you think. He raised me. But when the mission closed, he changed. He started bringing the girls to our house. He called them his words. But they weren't. They were prisoners. She clutched the ledger tighter. I heard him talking one night about selling a girl named May, a baby. I knew it was you. I had to get you out. So I started the fire. Jessie stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. The fire at the mission. That was you? I had to create a distraction, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. So you could run. All of you. I pointed you this way. I knew about the old rancher who lived alone. I prayed you'd make it here. Elas staggered back from the barn wall, his mind reeling. The knock on the door, the children arriving as if by magic. It wasn't magic. It was a plan. A desperate, hopeless plan hatched by a girl trying to save them. He pushed the barn door open. Jessie and Annabelle spun around, their faces etched with fear. It's all right, Ellis said, his voice softer than he felt. You're safe here. Annabelle flinched, her eyes darting toward him. And that's when Elas saw it. Her eyes weren't just wide with fear. They were unfocused, hazy. She was blind, or very nearly so. She could see shapes, light and shadow, but nothing more. He did this to me, she whispered, as if reading his mind. When I was little, an accident. He said it was my punishment for being wicked. The cruelty of it was a physical blow. Elas felt the rage rise in him again, hot and black. He looked at Jessie, who was staring at Annabelle with an expression of dawning horror and something else, a fierce protective instinct that mirrored his own. They brought Annabelle inside. Clara took one look at the girl's terrified face and the precious, damning ledger in her hands and pulled her into an embrace. They were in this together now, all of them. That night, they pored over the ledger by lamplight. It was worse than they had imagined. Dozens of names, ages, prices, descriptions, a cold, methodical accounting of human souls. Leah's name was there, and Jessie's, and Ruth's, and May's, each with a price next to it. But there was another name that made Clara gasp and drop the book as if it had burned her. A name from her own past, a name she thought she had buried 20 years ago, Lillian Moore, her younger sister. No, Clara breathed, her face ashen. It can't be. Elas looked at her, confused. Clara, what is it? My sister, she whispered, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. She ran away from home when she was 16. We never heard from her again. We thought she was dead. She pointed a trembling finger at the ledger. Next to her sister's name was a notation. Sold to V. Cannell. Price, $20 silver. Cannell, the bounty hunter, the messenger, and next to the entry was another note, written in a different hand, a single word, deceased. But the most chilling part was the final entry in the book. It was under Annabelle's name. It wasn't a price. It was a destination. The Greaves estate. Marshall Greaves, the man who told Ellis to go home and pray, the man who was supposed to be the law. He wasn't just ignoring Vaser. He was his business partner, his most important client. They weren't just hiding from a monster. The monster was wearing a badge, and he knew exactly where they were. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, and the walls were closing in. Panic, cold and sharp, settled over the small adobe house. The ledger lay on the table like a coiled snake, its secrets poisoning the air. Marshall Greaves wasn't just corrupt. He was their final destination. Annabelle wasn't just another girl to be sold. She was a delivery promised to the highest authority in the territory. He was playing with me, Elas said, his voice hollow as he paced the room. His whole speech, telling me to lay low. He was just making sure we'd stay put, making sure the delivery would be easy. Jessie stood by the window, peering out into the oppressive darkness. He'll be coming soon. Now that Annabelle's here with the book, they can't wait. We have to run, Clara said, her voice shaking as she looked at her sister's name in the ledger. The sister she had mourned for decades, sold like cattle. Run where? Ellis countered, his hope shriveling. Greaves is the law. Every road, every town. He has eyes everywhere. We'd be caught before we made 10 miles. They were trapped, boxed in by the desert on one side and a corrupt system on the other. For a moment, despair was so thick in the room it felt hard to breathe. Then Annabelle spoke, her voice surprisingly steady. There is one person, one man Greaves is afraid of. All eyes turned to her. His name is Marshal Burke, she said, her sightless eyes seeming to look right through them. He's the territorial circuit marshal. He outranks Greaves. My father, Vassar, he mentioned him once. He said Burke was an old dog who couldn't be bought. He called him inconvenient. A tiny flicker of hope, a single guttering candle in a hurricane. Where is he? Elas asked. He's based out of San Miguel, Annabelle said. 2 days' ride east, if you could get the ledger to him. A plan began to form, desperate and razor-thin. It was a suicide mission, but it was better than waiting to be slaughtered. Elas would ride for San Miguel at first light. He was the oldest, the most unassuming. He might make it through without raising suspicion. Jessie would stay behind, to protect the girls. Clara would prepare for the worst. No, Jessie said, his voice firm. I'll go, I'm faster. And you're the first person they'll be looking for, Elas argued. A boy on a fast horse is a target. An old rancher heading to town for supplies is just part of the scenery. They argued back and forth, the minutes ticking by like heartbeats. Finally, Clara put an end to it. Elas is right, she said, her voice filled with a grim certainty. He goes. Jessie, your job is here. Protect them. Protect this house. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. With your life. Jessie nodded, his young face set with a terrible gravity. The night was endless. No one slept. Clara packed a small satchel for Elas with dried meat, a water skin, and the ledger, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a false bottom. Every stitch, every fold, felt like a prayer. At the first hint of dawn, Elas was in the saddle. He kissed Clara, a long, desperate kiss that said everything they couldn't speak. He clasped Jessie's shoulder. You're the man of the house now. Then he was gone, a silhouette melting into the gray pre-dawn light. They watched until he was a speck on the horizon. Then they went inside and bolted the door. The waiting was a special kind of hell. Every hour stretched into a lifetime. Clara tried to keep the children busy, but the fear was a living thing in the house. Ruth wouldn't leave Clara's side. May, sensing the tension, was fussy and tearful. Annabelle sat by the hearth, her hands clasped, her face a pale mask. Jessie was a ghost. He moved from window to window, the old rifle never leaving his hands. He checked the perimeter of the house a dozen times. He barricaded the back door with a heavy chest. He was a boy playing soldier, preparing for a war he couldn't possibly win. The first day passed, then the first night. The silence from the outside world was more terrifying than any sound. On the second morning, just as the sun began to bake the desert floor, they heard it. Hoofbeats. Not one rider, many. Coming fast, Jessie ran to the front window. His blood ran cold. It wasn't Greaves. It wasn't the law. It was Vassar. He was riding at the head of a pack of 5 men, their faces hard and cruel. They rode with the confidence of predators who had their prey cornered. And tied to Vassar's saddle, slumped and bleeding, was Connell, the bounty hunter. He had clearly tried to double-cross his former employer and had paid the price. Vassar reined in his horse just beyond the fence line. He smiled, a chilling, triumphant expression. "Annabelle!" he called out, his voice slick and oily. "You've been a very naughty girl. You took something that belongs to me. I've come to get it back, and to collect my other property." His eyes swept over the house. "Send out the children, and I'll let the old woman live. You have my word." Inside, Clara herded the girls into the small root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. "Stay here, and do not make a sound, no matter what you hear," she commanded. Jesse stood by the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at Clara. Her face was grim, but her eyes were blazing. She was holding Elas's old heavy pistol. "He thinks we're just an old woman and a boy," she said, her voice low and steady. "He's about to find out how wrong he is." The first shot wasn't from Vaser's men. It was from Clara. She fired the pistol through the window, the bullet kicking up dust right in front of Vaser's horse. The battle for the adobe house had begun. The world exploded in a chaos of sound and fury. Vaser's men, startled by the shot from the house, returned fire. Bullets thudded into the thick adobe walls, sending chips of dried mud flying. Splinters erupted from the window frames. Jesse dropped to the floor, dragging Clara down with him. "Get away from the window!" he yelled over the din. The rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands. He'd shot at rabbits before, never at men. He crawled to the side of the window, poked the barrel through, and fired at the shapes moving outside. He didn't know if he hit anything. He just fired, reloaded, and fired again, the explosions deafening in the small space. Clara was on the other side of the room, reloading the old pistol with shaking hands. Her face was a mask of grim determination. This wasn't the gentle woman who baked bread and hummed lullabies. This was a lioness defending her den. "They're trying to circle around to the back," she shouted. Jesse scrambled across the floor to the small rear window. He saw two men creeping along the fence line, trying to get to the less fortified back door. He took aim, his breath held tight in his chest, and fired. One of the men cried out and dropped to his knees, clutching his leg. The other one dove for cover. A small victory, but it wouldn't last. There were too many of them. Outside, Vaser was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the gunfire. "Burn them out! Smoke them out like the rats they are!" Jesse's heart seized. Fire. Their one great weakness. The old wooden roof would go up like a tinderbox. He saw one of the men running toward the house with a torch. He had to stop him. He fired the last round in the rifle. The man with the torch stumbled, but didn't fall. He was still coming. "I'm out!" Jesse yelled, his voice raw with panic. "Here!" Clara tossed him the pistol. He caught it just as the man reached the side of the house. Jesse leaned out the window, ignoring the bullets whining past his head, took aim with the heavy pistol, and fired. The man with the torch crumpled to the ground, the flame extinguishing in the dust. A cheer almost escaped Jesse's lips, but it died in his throat. From the root cellar below, he heard a muffled cry. May. The baby had started crying. Vaser heard it too. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "So, the little birds are in the basement," he called out. "This changes things. We don't have to burn you out after all. We can just wait." The gunfire stopped. An eerie silence fell, broken only by the sound of May's frightened cries. They were in a stalemate. Vaser couldn't get in. They couldn't get out. But he had time, and they had a crying baby whose wails were a beacon, a constant reminder of the precious lives huddled in the darkness below. Hours passed. The sun beat down on the small house, turning it into an oven. Their water was running low. The adrenaline faded, replaced by a gnawing, bone-deep exhaustion. Clara and Jesse sat on the floor, backs against the wall, listening to the occasional taunts from Vaser, listening to the soft whimpers from the cellar, listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would mean Elas had failed. "He's not coming back, is he?" Jesse whispered, the hope finally draining out of him. Clara reached out and took his hand. Her own was cold and clammy. "We don't know that." But her eyes told a different story. They were alone. As dusk began to settle, Vaser's voice rang out again, closer this time. He was at the front door. "I'm growing impatient, Clara," he said, and the sound of her name, so familiar and casual from his lips, sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. "How do you know her name?" she called out, her voice trembling. A low chuckle came from the other side of the door. "Oh, we go way back. Ask me about your sister. Lillian. I remember her well. Feisty girl. Looked a lot like you. The blood drained from Clara's face. You have one last chance, Vaser continued. Send out Annabelle and the ledger, and I'll let the others go. My business is with her. Jesse looked at Clara, his eyes asking the impossible question. No, Clara said, her voice like flint. We don't sacrifice one to save the others. We live together, or we die together. Suddenly there was a loud crash from the back of the house. One of Vaser's men had managed to break through the barricaded door. Jesse spun around, raising the pistol, just as a large, brutish man burst into the room. The man lunged. Jesse fired, but the shot went wide. He was knocked to the ground, the pistol flying from his grasp. The man was on top of him, his huge hands closing around Jesse's throat. Jesse's vision began to swim. Black spots danced before his eyes. He was going to die. Then, there was another deafening blast, right next to his ear. The man on top of him went rigid. His weight suddenly became dead weight. He collapsed onto Jesse, a dark hole blossoming in the back of his head. Clara stood over them, the rifle in her hands, smoke curling from the barrel. She had saved his life, but the shot had been a signal. From outside, there was a roar of anger, and the front door shuddered as men began to throw their weight against it. It was about to break. This was the end. And then, from the distance, another sound. A single piercing whistle, followed by the thunder of a dozen charging horses. Jesse scrambled out from under the dead man, his lungs burning. He crawled to the window and looked out. Riding hard out of the setting sun was a posse of men, and at their head, on a powerful black horse, was a tall, grim-faced man with a silver star glinting on his chest. Marshal Burke, and riding beside him, his face streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes blazing with righteous fury, was Elas. He had made it. He hadn't failed them. Help had arrived, but it was too late. The front door splintered, burst inward, and Vaser stood there, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of pure evil. He wasn't looking at the approaching riders. He was looking straight at Jesse, and behind him Ruth had crept up from the cellar, her small face pale with terror. Vaser smiled. Checkmate. He grabbed Ruth, pulling her in front of him as a shield. Time seemed to bend and stretch. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats, the splintering wood of the door, Vaser's triumphant face. It all happened in a horrifying, slow-motion ballet. Vaser held Ruth tight against him, the barrel of his pistol pressed to her small temple. The little girl was frozen in terror, her eyes wide, fixated on Jesse. "Nobody moves!" Vaser screamed, his voice raw with desperation, as Marshal Burke's posse thundered into the yard. "One step closer and the girl dies!" Burke reined in his horse, his face grim, his men fanning out, rifles raised. Elas slid from his saddle, his eyes wild, landing on Clara and Jesse, then on the monster holding his little Ruth hostage. A strangled cry escaped his lips. "Let the child go, Vaser!" Burke commanded, his voice like rolling thunder. "It's over." "It's not over until I say it is," Vaser snarled, his eyes darting around like a cornered animal. "I want a clear path out of here. And I'm taking my daughter and my ledger with me." He jerked his head toward the cellar door. "Annabelle, get out here now, or your little friend pays the price." From the cellar, there was a sob. Then, slowly, Annabelle emerged from the darkness, her blind eyes wide with fear, her hands clutching the precious ledger. "Don't," Jesse whispered. "Don't give it to him." "Give me the book, Annabelle," Vaser ordered, his voice dangerously soft. "Give it to your father." Annabelle hesitated, turning her head toward the sound of Jesse's voice, then back to her father. She took a shuffling step forward. This was the moment, the turning point. Everything they had fought for, everything they had bled for, was about to be lost. And then something shifted in Jesse. The fear, the exhaustion, the helplessness, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, cold rage. He was not a boy anymore. He was a survivor, and he would not let this happen. He looked at Ruth, held in Vaser's grip. He saw the terror in her eyes, and he remembered Leah. He remembered the cellar. He remembered the promise he'd made to himself. Never again. While all eyes were on Vaser and Annabelle, Jesse moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He dove. He launched himself across the floor, low and fast, straight at Vaser's legs. It was the move of a desperate animal, fueled by love and fury. He hit Vaser at the knees, a solid, brutal impact that took the man completely by surprise. Vaser stumbled backward, his balance gone. His grip on Ruth loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all Elis needed. He moved with the speed of a striking snake. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, yanked Ruth away from Vaser, and threw her behind him toward Clara. Vaser, enraged, tried to bring his pistol around to fire at Ellis, but from the doorway, a shot rang out. It wasn't from Marshal Burke. It wasn't from one of his deputies. It was Annabelle. She was holding the old pistol Clara had dropped. Her hands were shaking. Her blind eyes were streaming with tears, but she was pointing it straight at the sound of her father's voice. She had fired from pure instinct, from sound and memory. The bullet struck Vaser in the shoulder. He screamed, a sound of agony and shock, and dropped his own gun. Jesse scrambled for it. Burke's men swarmed into the house. It was over in seconds. Vaser was subdued, his men rounded up, their fight gone. Elas was holding Ruth, rocking her, his face buried in her hair. Clara was kneeling beside them, her hand on his back. Jesse slowly got to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He looked at Annabelle, who stood frozen, the pistol still held out in front of her, smoke curling from its barrel. He walked over to her and gently took the gun from her trembling hands. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I heard his voice," she sobbed, collapsing against him. I couldn't let him hurt anyone else." He held her tight, this blind girl who had seen more clearly than anyone, this brave girl who had saved them all. Marshal Burke stepped forward, his eyes taking in the scene, the battered family, the terrified children, the wounded monster on the floor. He picked up the ledger that Annabelle had dropped. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first page. He looked from the book to Vaser, then to Elas and Clara. "I'll be damned," he said, his voice full of a weary awe. "You got him. You actually got him." Elas looked at his wife, at the 3 children who had come to his door, at the brave girl who had fired the shot that ended the nightmare. His home was scarred, his body was bruised, but his heart was full. They weren't just a collection of broken people anymore. They were a family, forged in fire and fear, but a family nonetheless. And for the first time in 20 years, Elas knew, with absolute certainty, that they were finally home. In the aftermath, the desert seemed to exhale. The sharp edges of the world softened. Vaser and his men, including the disgraced Marshal Greaves, were taken away in chains by Burke's posse. The ledger, that little book of horrors, became the key that unlocked a dozen cold cases and brought a dark chapter of the territory to a close. But for the family in the adobe house, the silence Vaser left behind was the loudest sound of all. It was a silence filled with healing. Elas and Clara officially adopted Jesse, Ruth, and May. The papers, signed by Marshal Burke himself, were framed and hung on the wall. It wasn't just a legal document. It was a testament, a declaration that this was their home, forever. Annabelle stayed with them. She had nowhere else to go, and no one wanted her to leave. She became a permanent fixture, a quiet, steady presence. She and Jesse were inseparable. He became her eyes, describing the color of the sunset, the shape of the clouds, the flight of a hawk. She, in turn, taught him a different way of seeing, how to listen to the world, to feel its rhythms, to understand the things that lay beneath the surface. One evening, Elas sat with Annabelle on the porch, watching the last of the light fade from the sky. "Marshal Burke told me something," he said quietly. "He found a doctor in San Miguel, a specialist. He works with eyes. He thinks he might be able to help you." Annabelle was silent for a long time. She turned her face toward Elas, her hazy eyes seeming to search his. "I'm scared," she whispered. Of what? Of seeing, she said. This world, the one I know now, it's safe, it's kind. What if seeing the real world breaks that? What if I see things I don't want to see? What if, she didn't say, I see your faces, and you're not what I've imagined? What if I look at Jessie and the boy I love isn't there? Alas reached out and took her hand. The world can be ugly, he said, but it can also be beautiful, and you deserve to see the beauty, Annabelle. You've earned it. He squeezed her hand. And no matter what you see, you will always see love here. That will never change. The decision was hers, but the whole family held its breath. It was Jessie who finally convinced her. I want you to see me, he said one night, his voice raw. Not the image you have in your head. Me. I want you to see my face when I tell you that I love you. And so, she agreed. The journey to San Miguel was filled with a quiet, nervous hope. The operation was long and delicate. For 2 weeks, Annabelle lived in a world of complete darkness, her eyes covered in thick bandages. Jessie never left her side. He read to her, he talked to her, he held her hand when the fear crept in. The day the bandages came off, the whole family was there. Elas, Clara, Ruth, and May, all crammed into the small doctor's office. The doctor slowly, carefully unwrapped the gauze. Annabelle blinked. Once. Twice. The light was a painful, overwhelming blur. Shapes swam before her, indistinct and strange. And then, the blur began to resolve. A face swam into focus. A young man's face, scarred and weathered, with kind, anxious eyes, and a mouth turned down in a worried frown. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his cheek. Jessie? She whispered. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on his own cheek. A slow smile spread across Annabelle's face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. You're even more handsome than I imagined, she said. He let out a laugh that was half a sob. I was just hoping not to scare you off. Never, she whispered. She looked around the room, her eyes drinking in the faces of the people she loved. She saw Clara's gentle, tear-streaked face. She saw Elas's rugged, kind features. She saw little Ruth, beaming, and May, staring with wide, curious eyes. This was her family. This was her world, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to dream. They were married a year later, under the shade of the old cottonwood tree behind the house. Annabelle wore a simple white dress sewn by Clara. Jessie stood tall, his hand steady in hers. Years passed like water flowing through the desert. The children grew, the ranch flourished. The laughter in the adobe house grew louder, fuller. Ruth married a local blacksmith. May became the town's schoolteacher, ensuring no child was ever forgotten again. Jessie and Annabelle filled the house with children of their own, each one a testament to the love that had bloomed in the face of so much darkness. One evening, as Elas and Clara sat on the porch, old and gray but content, watching their grandchildren chase fireflies in the twilight, a rider appeared on the road. It was Connell, the bounty hunter. He was older, his face etched with the hard lines of a difficult life. He dismounted at the gate and held up his hands in a gesture of peace. I'm not here for trouble, he said. I had to see. His eyes swept over the bustling, happy scene. Heard what happened. Heard you won. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn pouch. He tossed it to Elas. It landed with a heavy chink. What's this? Elas asked. 20 silver dollars, Connell said, his voice rough. And then some. It's the money Vaser paid me for your sister-in-law all those years ago, and every dime I ever made working for him. I don't want it. He tipped his hat. You folks, you built something good here, something right. And without another word, he mounted his horse and rode away, a man finally trying to balance his own ledger. Elas looked at the pouch of silver, then at his wife, at the sprawling, beautiful, chaotic family they had built from the ashes of tragedy. They hadn't just survived, they had triumphed. They had taken a world of darkness and filled it with light. If you enjoyed this story and believe that even in the darkest of places, a little bit of light can make all the difference, don't forget to like and subscribe, because there are always more stories out there waiting to be told.